So where do we begin with entrepreneurial marketing? Where does this really start? We want to start with some basic definitions. I want to make sure that we understand some fundamentals about businesses, about startups, about growth, about business models. In these first few lectures, it's really about establishing how a company functions and helping people understand what are the parts and pieces that I need in place in order to be successful. And then that helps us really start to define what our value proposition is and how we're going to bring our product or our service to market. So the very first thing that we talk about when we talk about entrepreneurial marketing is we talk about business model. And in order to understand business model, we need to go a little bit more fundamental. So the first question is, what is a company? When we think about a company, what makes a company different than any other type of organization? Your soccer team, your community group that you belong to, maybe a religious group. What is the difference between an organization and an actual company? So a business organization is one that sells a product or service in exchange for revenue and profit. Now there's some key words in there, revenue and profit. It's important that first of all we understand that revenue coming in the door is a very big milestone for businesses. There's some businesses that can get to revenue almost instantly. In fact, I know several businesses that started because they already had revenue. Somebody was in demand, they were already taking orders, and they said, you know, we need to form a company around this. And so that can be a driving force for how a business begins. There's other businesses that can take literally years and years of research and development, getting the product or the service exactly right before they take it to market. And so there's a big milestone, which is revenue. It's money coming in the door. People that are paying you because they like your idea, they like your product, they like your service. They're willing to hand you money in exchange for what it is you do. However, the second part of that, which is profit, this is something that's a little bit of a struggle for some types of entrepreneurs. Some people think that just because they have money coming in the door means that they are a functioning business. But really a business is about generating a profit. Even if it's a small profit at the beginning, it's really about finding that profitable model and then being able to scale and repeat it, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. So how are companies organized? How do we set up a company? And this is something that in the many startups that I've done, I've had to go back and reassess a company at the most basic level and look at how I've organized a company. So think about an org chart. Think about people in an org chart and their functions and what do they do. So we've got people over here that are managers, people that are their subordinates and are carrying out work. We've got HR that's doing recruiting and adding more workers to our group. We've got maybe some intellectual property that we hold. There's all these different parts and pieces within a company that are organized around a business model. And so companies are organized around business models to make sure that all the parts and pieces of the company are, first of all, necessary, and second of all, that they are generating a profit. And there are auxiliary parts of a business that sometimes won't generate a profit, but for the most part, businesses need to be organized around a model, and we need to know exactly why we have each person and each function within that company. One of the things that I've noticed over the years when we go through a startup process, sometimes we collect people and operations and activities along the way that maybe they were good at the beginning, but they're not so good once we've gotten to a certain scale. And so as a founder, as a CEO, as a business owner, whichever phase that you're in, it's always important to be able to go back and do a self-assessment and say, what is my company and how is it organized? And is it really organized around my business model? So what is a business model? Well, the business model describes all the parts and pieces of a company that are necessary to make money, the revenue and then the profit. And so if we are thinking about, let's say something very basic, we want to open a shoe store. Well, we're obviously going to need a location, a brick and mortar. Maybe it's an online store. Maybe it's a hybrid between both. So we might need a website and a brick and mortar. We start to define these questions and we start to state, well, this is how we want to go to market. This is what we want to do. And we start to extrapolate our idea into the parts and pieces that we need. If we did have a brick and mortar, we need employees to sell shoes, we need a manager, we need a point of sale system, we need an inventory process, we need suppliers for the shoes. We have all these parts and pieces, key activities, resources, all the things that we need in order to create this business model. So sometimes in tech startups and other startups, especially scientific inventions, people are concerned with their technology, their idea, what they developed. And we can call anything that is unique, that's your idea, that you've come up with, we can call that your technology. So a lot of people are concerned, well, what about my technology? Isn't that the business model? Isn't what I have invented the whole reason that we're going to go into business? Well, it's one of the many critical pieces. It's not the entire business model. And this is very important to remember as a founder, that just because you've got a great idea, a unique idea, a new idea, an improved idea, doesn't necessarily mean that money just rolls in the door. And so your invention, your technology that's unique to you, is only going to be beneficial to you and your company if you have all the other parts and pieces. Years and years ago, I worked with the University of Utah, and I worked in a whole bunch of scientific startups. And one of the things that I noticed is these scientists sometimes would spend years in the lab, in clinic, in all kinds of experimentation, and would come up with their technology or their idea or their product, whatever it was they would invent. And there was always a general feeling that, hey, I invented this, so that is the company. That is what is going to make us, the millions, the billions of dollars. Except for technology on its own usually doesn't have any legs. It typically requires us to put a business around that technology, commercialize it, and take it to market before we start to see that revenue and ultimately profit. And because of that, a lot of universities have what they call a tech transfer office, where they will match the ideas and the IP that comes out of a university with private industry in order to create license agreements, in order to create entrepreneurial ventures. And so your technology doesn't necessarily propel your business forward. It requires many other parts. So customers, they really just don't care about the technology in and of itself. They only care about solving their problems. And sometimes it's a problem and sometimes it's just an added value to their life, but they will flock to your technology as long as your technology is solving a problem. And sometimes it requires that your idea is packaged with something else. The way the service, the way the product comes to market, a certain price model. There's a lot of things that will make your technology valuable to that consumer, and then ultimately you'll start to see the benefits of what you've invented. So what is a startup? We talk a lot about companies, but what is specifically a startup or the startup phase of a company? Now, you hear this all the time from companies. They say, oh, we've been around 10 years, but we're really more of a startup. I think when people make statements like that, they're referring more to, we ride skateboards around the office, we've got a loose atmosphere. That doesn't necessarily make you a startup. Just because everyone rides a Razor scooter around your reclaimed warehouse and you've got a real hip vibe to your company, that doesn't make you a startup. A startup has a very specific definition. So a startup is a temporary organization that is designed to search for repeatable and scalable business models. So think about that for a minute. It's a temporary organization where you're trying to search for revenue and then ultimately profit. And so being in startup mode is really a way of saying, we know an idea, we know kind of what we want to do. We're in the process of testing it with the marketplace and making sure that what our idea is going to be a good product market fit. And then once we get that product market fit, we get into scaling and really growing the company at an exponential rate. And at that point, we're no longer a startup. We're not in search mode. We're not in test mode. We're actually scaling the company. And all companies are in growth mode. Every company I've ever seen wants to grow. Whether or not they're successful is different. but everybody wants to grow. And so being in growth mode doesn't necessarily make you a startup. A startup is about defining your model. So in the next lecture, we're going to talk a little more about the parts and pieces that go into that business model. So I'll see you in the next lecture.